There are several of our Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy team members who are with us today who will monitor the chat, but make sure to introduce yourself and your organization if you would like to in the chat. Once we get to the back end of today's presentation, of course, we'll have a question and answer session. So we'll certainly make time for that as well too. Again, thank you for joining us. I'll go ahead and get into some of today's presentation. So today we're going to talk about ethical leadership and the importance of conduct and character in nonprofit leaders. With that, I should say that most of the content that I'll walk through today certainly is not specific to nonprofit leaders, because the issue of ethical leadership cuts across a variety of disciplines. So though most of it will feel familiar in terms of its content and maybe how it applies to public service, what we focus on here at the Bush School, the content today really cuts across a variety of sectors, all sectors, I would argue, when you mention ethical leadership. With that, let me just do a quick overview of the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy. Our mission is to support the vibrancy of the nonprofit sector and the philanthropic sector here in the state of Texas and beyond through high quality research, professional outreach and development, and engaged learning. And if you see our markers, preparing leaders really has to do with our educational offerings as a graduate school of public service and administration. So we have a variety of graduate level programs, degrees, and also certificate offerings in nonprofit management, public management, and policy analysis. Strengthening organizations and systems is really specific to how we're staffed here at the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy, where we offer fee-based opportunities for nonprofit organizations out there, whether it has to do with professional development of employees, organizational development, also capacity building. And then the last piece that you see there is improving and understanding scholarship. And of course, we have researchers here at the Bush School that study and develop scholarship in a variety of areas here at the school. So we do all of those things. And the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy was launched in 2017, 7 years ago, which is when I started here at Texas A&M in the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy. So it's been quite the journey thus far. So again, thank you and welcome today. You don't have to look very far to come across scandals or fraud in the nonprofit area. Seems like they aren't talked about a whole lot, but just in starting today's presentation, if we think about what happens at organizational or what's at stake at nonprofit organizations when there are unethical leaders at the helm. And so I just provided a few examples for us to reflect on. My background in the nonprofit sector before transitioning over into academia is as a nonprofit professional. I left Big Brothers Big Sisters as the CEO of that organization over in Austin after a 12-year career with them, but I also worked in the sector for another 12 years in a variety of positions, starting when I was a college student. And so the reason I guess this is important to me has to do with having transitioned out of the sector. My concern was, who are tomorrow's leaders? What skill sets do they have? What competencies? How committed are they to the industry? Are they ethical? Something that you have to be committed to when you come into the public service field. And so, again, some of these examples you may be familiar with, but some of them were quite a while ago. This first example with Red Cross. Red Cross, when the earthquakes happened in Haiti in 2010, raised approximately $500 million. And it was said or found that nearly 125 million of those dollars went unaccounted for. And everything from what was in the media, what was found about what happened during that time was that they double counted those that they were serving, they undercounted those they were serving, and in one instance, they found that Red Cross actually claimed to have helped more people than actually lived in the area that they were working in. And just as it goes with philanthropy and with nonprofit organizations, when disasters strike, just like those that we're experiencing currently across the United States, any of you all that are impacted by that personally, I have friends, we certainly know that nonprofit organizations and that we on this call today will pull out of our pockets to support those efforts as we do across the United States when things like this happen. So we want to have some faith that when we give of our philanthropic dollars, that they will be put to good use. But we also know, again, just to today's session, that depending on who is the leader at those organizations, what potentially could happen if we don't pay attention to, again, something that isn't talked about all that often in the space. Another example, this was one that, of course, I paid attention to when I was working on my dissertation research, was the Wounded Warriors Project. Basically, what was found here, this one was a big case that was in the news, but nearly $800 million in donations. They were criticized about how they spent that money. Tons of waste and abuse, these lavish conferences, outings that for something that is so special and that we already hear a lot of bad news on how veterans are supported, for an organization in the name of supporting veterans for something like this to happen. And of course, what eventually happened there is the CEO and the COO both were fired by the board. That was another case from 2016. And I mentioned to you all that I proudly worked and served the mission of Big Brothers Big Sisters for 12 years of my professional career. And this was something that I actually found out about recently, that Big Brothers Big Sisters had to pay the United States $1.6 million for the way that they commingled grant funds, federal grants, funds into their general operating funds, and failing to segregate expenditures to ensure that they were used as those funds were intended to. And in this particular case, I mean, I actually knew the CEO, worked with him, whose watch this actually happened on. And of course, it wasn't someone that I believe would ever go there. All I was familiar with of his good heart, dedication to the mission, someone who had served as a board member, who eventually went on to become the national CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters. So all of these don't have to be such big cases, but the reason why I guess I pointed these three examples out is that the most common form of fraud tends to be theft of money, or the misuse of funds, or the improper disclosure or improper disclosures on financial statements at organizations. So with that said, just in terms of some of what we do know from academic literature related to some of this stuff, is that this isn't nothing new. It doesn't take, even though I use the examples that I did, a quick internet search, you'll find really recent activity, whether it be lots of fraud related to COVID-19, of course, lots of fraud in the states of Florida, Minnesota, California. We see fraud all over the place. We even realize it in our own local communities. Nearly every community that I've lived in, there's been some form of fraud that has taken place at our local organizations that serve. But we know that as early as the 19th century, there is documentation of misappropriated funds from public schools. One thing that's good as it stands today, this is actually from some research from 2021, is that there are no lack of scandals, but there also isn't any evidence of growing distrust, which is highly important because nonprofit and charitable organizations, public trust and public funds is really everything, how we go about delivering on our mission, sustaining our organizations. But that does not mean that something could tip us over into where there is certainly a high distrust of organizations. And those of us that protect, that serve the sector certainly don't want to see that happen. We know from research that the bad actors and transgressors are those that hold positions of power. So executive directors and CEOs, CFOs of nonprofit organizations. Overall, the research points out that women and people with lower salaries tend to commit fraud when you look at it on an average basis. And we also know that men and older people with higher salaries commit larger levels of fraud, which those were some, I guess, would be considered some of the ones that I pointed out in the examples that I shared with you. We tend to see this at urban organizations versus rural. And we also see this at organizations who outsource their payroll. I guess it opens the door for fraud to happen. And just as we talk about with some of the other opportunities that we provide from a training standpoint, good governance and internal controls protect from fraud. So anytime we have internal controls where we have accounting metrics that protect organizations' assets. Dr. Brown and I, Dr. Seaworth and I, the team of us here, when we talk about good governance, that there's oversight of the organizations from a fiscal and legal standpoint, and that the CEOs or the executive directors of these organizations aren't empowered to deliver on everything at the organization where the board isn't engaged in that process of decision making and oversight at organizations is one reason why we tend to hone in on that space quite a bit in terms of we know just as well as our boards perform that our organizations tend to perform as well. Okay, so let's get into the leadership ethics just a bit, just to do some introduction where we get kind of a little bit more specific into what I'm presenting to you today really comes from the study of leadership. So the leadership studies academic discipline is where I'm pulling some of this from. Of course, there's a variety of definitions that you'll find out there when we talk about ethical leadership. But specifically based on my background as someone who holds a PhD in leadership studies, that's where I pull this from. So interest in the nature of ethical leadership continues to grow, mostly due to corporate scandals. Nonprofits are corporations too, just like we pulled. But of course, we can all probably point to scandals in for-profit environments, but we see them, of course, in nonprofit environments as well too. And the other piece is in the political realm as well too, as we tend to see all these scandals, there's usually or always a call for hiring people with more ethics, whether it be our politicians and what we see in our corporate leaders as well too. In the scheme of things in the leadership studies discipline, looking at ethics is really a new area of inquiry in terms of scholarship. So though we certainly have some background of how ethics applies in leadership, there's not a deep history of it either. So this is, what I would call initial studies related to ethics specific to the leadership studies discipline. But since today is really about, there's a couple of different ways that we can look at ethics, whether it be individually and our responsibility, but also there's things that we would anticipate or expect from our organizations as well. Today is really kind of more about, individually, what we can pass on to you as individuals that decided to take a part of your day to take part in something that I would consider professional development. But one way to think about this, of course, is um, the daily focus on ethical issues that arise in leadership situations. How you respond, how others respond to lead or as leaders related to ethical issues on a daily basis in your respective workplaces. How do we hold that standard up high? Is it something that you see or experience from those that you consider peers as leaders, or that you notice in your organization, or something that you question yourself about or don't question yourself about as you go about what it is that you do on a daily basis? So in terms of, definition that, ethics, provides a system of principles that guide us in basically in making decisions about what's either right or wrong or good or bad in particular situations. And while we say particular situations is most of the research that's conducted in the leadership studies space has to do with how we react in situations as they present themselves and the decisions that we make based on a certain situation, which I imagine is the reason why it's defined this way. But it's concerned with the kinds of values and morals an individual or society finds either desirable and or appropriate. And in any decision-making situation, ethical issues are either implicit or explicitly involved in that process. So in terms of the actual theories that we pull from research, really has to do with I guess what you saw as the title, but also the way that it breaks down is into two broad domains regarding ethics when we think about ourselves as individuals or others as individuals. The way that we tend to break this down is what is our personal conduct or someone else's personal conduct, so the actions of leaders, and then what is the character of leaders, those who we are as people. So conduct and character is the way we tend to break this down in terms of those two domains, how we look at what ethics means related to us individually. So in the domain of conduct, there's two constructs. So teleological theory or deontological theory, consequences and duty. So related to consequences, do we go about our conduct? Is it based on a conduct that leads to desirable outcomes, or a duty that you have? And we see the duty come up again in the nonprofit research around this moral obligation that we should uphold on a daily basis if we work in the space related to nonprofits in general. But specific to consequences, there's again just three different constructs that we can look at, or that you can ask yourself. Do we make decisions that are in our own self-interest when making moral decisions? That's defined as ethical egoism, or utilitarianism, that actions are right if they are useful or for the benefit of a majority. And then altruism. I don't need to give all the definitions, but that just suggests that actions are moral if their primary purpose is to promote the interests of others. And then when we look at duty, that moral obligation to do the right thing, that actions are moral if the leader has a moral right to do them. If the actions themselves do not infringe on the moral rights of others, that's what we would look for in terms of, just doing the right thing? Are we not infringing on the moral rights of others, or to further the moral rights of others is what we look at in duty. So as you think about nonprofit organizations, if we commit our professional lives, our personal lives to nonprofit organizations, and there's a mission, you'll find in that research this idea of duty to the mission, duty to do the right thing, duty to ensure that the mission is held with the highest of standards at organizations. So that's just basically how we break down conduct. So again, do we lead based on desirable outcomes, or are we leading based on just our obligation to do the right thing? In the domain of character, this is really more a virtue-based construct. And so when we look at character, who are we as people? Um, we ask ourselves, what's in the heart of people, or what's in our own hearts if we work in this space? And what's our, disposition when we go to work every day? For those of you all that are joining us that find yourself in a service industry or a charitable industry, it was always the hardest thing to understand. Not to say that I haven't had bad days myself, but colleagues with poor dispositions that then have to go out and serve people. And how could you ever really truly commit to such work with a bad disposition, I guess is the question. Moral abilities are not innate. Some might argue that as well too. But from research, it just talks about moral abilities are not innate, but can also be acquired and learned through practice. So that's where most of the leadership literature really is. If you want to develop skills in a certain industry, if you want to develop competencies in a certain industry, you can do that if you work on it, if you practice. So same thing with moral abilities, that the research says they are not innate, but they can certainly be acquired and learned. And that's one reason, I guess, the comment that I just made of coworkers as leaders, what obligation do we have to those that may not be, say, all in on the mission-based work that we desire to do? And then when applied to leadership, people in those roles should attempt to, um, develop virtues such as perseverance, public spiritedness, integrity, truthfulness, fidelity, benevolence, humility. Again, I know that all of you all that are joining us today, of course, are familiar with all of this, but today, really, I think, when I look at all of this, is really just a reminder, um, how do we think about ourselves as leaders? Do we question ourselves as leaders? Something that I know I certainly personally tend to do with our students that are here to study public service and to go out and serve people. I think it's a fair question. Is it for you versus just simply ending up in the industry serving people without a real heart for the work, if it's something that you desire to do otherwise? I believe it to be a fair question that we can position to students, that if we work in the space, we should ask ourselves, what's really for you? The other thing that I think is important related to this is, my guess is all of you all know, I imagine many of you all are Aggies. I know not all of you are. But even with that said, I mean, we know that the public service sector is the third largest sector in the United States. And without getting into detail, my belief is with such a large sector and people looking for jobs, people just end up in the public service space. People just end up working for nonprofit organizations because that's where the work is. And if people just end up in the space, do they truly have a heart for it? Which is a reminder for those of you all visiting with us today. What's your responsibility as a leader if someone just ends up in the industry with the type of work that we're supposed to protect, what's your responsibility in getting them there? Is that for you? Do you have the capacity to take that on in a way that can transition those folks that just landed in the industry versus those that have a heart for the disposition for the type of work that we know is so important? So the centrality of ethics to leadership really, I don't want to sum it up here, but the influence dimension. So in the leadership studies space, basically, the defining or the definition, if you will, of leadership is influencing people toward a goal. And that influence dimension of leadership really requires leaders to have an impact on the lives of those being led. So if you think about that enormous responsibility, it's also an enormous ethical burden that all of you all on this call with us today, myself included, it's an enormous burden when you're responsible for leading others. You better, I guess what I'm saying is you better be right if you have that on you to lead others in a certain direction, which is really, what we do in the nonprofit and the charitable and the public service space. So even though I have listed, we need to influence people toward accomplishing mutual goals. We need to influence people toward the buy-in of organizational values. But just think about all those things that you personally need to influence people toward: the culture at the organization, doing extra work when I'm not getting paid for it, um, going out to happy hour when you don't drink because it's a social component of what you do at your place of employment. Um, if it's a faith-based organization, influencing people toward faith. I mean, those are, when we stop and think about it, you can think of your own things that apply in your respective setting, but just think about what all that entails. Think about going home at night and you encourage someone to do something that you knew wasn't right, but you did it anyways. Not you all personally, but I can certainly say over the course of my career, there's been some things that I've certainly had the opportunity to reflect on that mostly from earlier parts of my career, um, that probably did not align with the responsibility that I had to a mission-based organization. So in conclusion, I think I probably said this already, is make sure that you individually, especially if you work in the space or any type of work that you do, because like I said, this isn't specific to nonprofit management or nonprofit studies. It's not specific to the leadership studies academic discipline that I mentioned to you. Many of the things that we've talked about, if I had to get specific, is information that we find from research, whether it be from the biomedical field, business ethics, counseling, psychology, and also, again, from the leadership studies discipline. It cuts across all of it, ethics. So, again, hopefully this just serves as a reminder that we need to check ourselves. Like I mentioned, with students, I believe that it's fair for us to question them around, are you sure that this is something you want to invest in? Are you sure that this is something that you want to go work in? Because it's quite an investment, whether it be educationally and the time that we spend professionally on mission-based work. So we talked about conduct and character. You can fill in whatever's personal to you, but personality, values, skills that you have or don't have. Inquire with yourself within about what does ethics mean to you. Check others as well too. So uh, this makes me think, or when I was putting this together, of our academic integrity statement that Aggies don't lie, cheat, or steal, nor do they tolerate those who do. Now, of course, this can be tricky in a professional work setting, but in checking others, what do you do when you work alongside someone that you believe to be unethical? And I'm certainly not here to give any recommendations, but I would certainly say working for someone that's unethical and you know it the way that I was trained, which is maybe the reason why I presented some of those big cases that I highlighted a little earlier, is in a worst case scenario, again, the way that I was trained as a social worker coming out of school was think about the worst case scenario. In my case, working with kids in the youth development space, providing them with adult mentors with big brothers, big sisters. A worst case scenario for us was a child could be physically or sexually abused. So if you think about a worst case scenario, if you know someone that does not have ethics in a public service space, it doesn't have to be $1 million in theft. It could be $100,000 in theft and two people lose their jobs. Again, I don't need to get into any details too much there, but what I will say is I'll leave it to you is what's the worst case scenario that could happen in your respective professional settings for working for or alongside someone who's unethical? And what do you do about it? I don't know what that answer is, but one thing we certainly can do, and I'm reflecting on myself, is you can leave if it's that bad. But again, I'll leave that to you all to reflect on. And then lastly, just to remember that the principles of ethical leadership, in the nonprofit space, the research says friends of ours, peers of ours have pointed out that the attention to and sustaining the highest levels of ethical conduct must be a concern of every nonprofit leader. But principles as they are defined in some of the literature, at least that I referred to, really have to do with think about how you respect others, that we give credence to others' ideas and confirm them as human beings, that we serve others, that we place followers' welfare foremost in our plans, that we show justice, that leaders are concerned about issues of fairness and justice, and that we manifest honesty, that we represent reality as fully and completely as possible. What's really going on at our organization that we need to make sure that we're transparent about, and that we, again, build community, that we attend to civic virtue and the respective community goals and purpose. Now, you would think that kind of based on these principles of leadership, that it's directly from the charitable setting or nonprofit setting, but they aren't. They're from the leadership literature. But it's funny to me how they align, which is the reason why I believe this stuff cuts across wherever it is that we find ourselves. And with that, I'll say thank you to those of us, or those of you that joined us today. And then maybe we should open it up for any questions, reflections, or anything that we can. I haven't been paying attention to the chat. I see, I don't know if those are introductions or questions, but I think we can open it up now, and maybe I'll stop sharing and maybe we can just have a brief conversation.
Hey, Kenny.
Hey, Ron.
It wouldn't be me attending one of these if I didn't have a comment or two. And I just wanted to reflect on something you said about conduct. you mentioned it as you're either looking for desirable outcomes or best interest of others. And what hit me was that in essence, those are the same thing, that if you achieve one, you're getting the other one. And if you exclude one, you're excluding the other. So I think we need to remember in the positions that we're in, that there's a responsibility to align those two together and look to achieve both of those, and don't put one as more important than the other.
I like it. Thank you. What else? Any questions, comments?
I have a comment. Krista Heidi here.
Please.
I think also as nonprofit professionals, which I think a lot of us on this call are, is that we also have a responsibility, especially if we're a member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, that we have a code of conduct and ethics that we actually have to agree to when we join or renew our membership, et cetera. And I recently did that, and actually, it had been quite a while since I had actually read those, and I went back and read those. And I think that's where, sometimes I get stuck because despite my title, I'm not a leader in my organization. However, I think all of us, whether we are managing people or not, are leaders within our organizations. And I see some conduct that is going on that I try, it goes back to the tolerating the bad actors is, if they were a member of AFP, they could, association AFP, they could be removed from the organization for that behavior. And it also could affect how donors perceive us. There's a couple things that have recently happened that I'm just like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what to do with this.
Yeah, that serves as a great reminder for any. I imagine if you work in the fundraising space, those folks should be familiar with your code of ethics. But like you just mentioned, how often do people go back to those? I know that's something that's shared. We share those a lot with our students. But how often are professionals going back to those ethics when the pressure is on to bring in money for your organization to advance your mission? And again, I'm not a fundraiser, but I certainly had that responsibility as the CEO of an organization of some size at one point in my career, where it's a grind and on a daily basis. Again, really just hoping that this serves as a reminder. But it sounds like, without knowing the particulars of your situation, you really have to make some hard choices. And I know for me, all of us have to work, right? Especially, when I was much younger, and maybe you overlooked some of those things, but hopefully we all get to a point to where there's things that we can walk away from when we know that they're wrong, or we can find a solution to fixing whatever it might be that we question. And sometimes just having a conversation, it could be as simple as just having a conversation about some of those things that we have questions about. It doesn't have to be so extreme every time. I was reminded of that actually just the other day by a colleague of walk down and have a conversation with them. And though I have not done that yet, it might resolve kind of what's on my mind.
Yeah, unfortunately, in my situation, that's not going to resolve anything. I go back to donor perception. I mean, the donor may be well-intentioned in offering their weekend home to a member of leadership, but, code of ethics says you refuse it. You don't take them up on the offer, and I know that's a fine line. So, it's just, I just wanted to remind our colleagues on here that are in the nonprofit space that we do have this other, code of conduct that we are, as fundraising professionals, we are held accountable to.
Absolutely. And again, I'm glad you also pointed that out is because it's something that I did not mention. We find that in the fundraising space, and we tend to get there certainly is a trend of, nonprofit organizations, charitable organizations developing a list of values. We've seen organizations go through that process, or a code of conduct, or a code of duty, identifying those things. But once we get them down, I guess the question is, what do we do with them on a daily basis when we think about our work responsibilities? What do we do with that stuff? And just like you mentioned, just like something else I think I pointed out during this time, is that what do we do with it in specific situations is really the question. How do you react as a leader in specific situations? Thank you for sharing that.
Kenny, if I could, let me follow up on her statement there. We have to remember that we serve two bosses in the nonprofit world. Those that we serve, those that we provide service for, but also on the backside is those that are supporting our service. And we have to remember that their perception is their reality, and it may not align with ours. So we have to stay focused on what is our value system. And we have to let that ride through the tough times or the questionable times, because at the end of the day, that's all we have left to stand on. And if we stay true to that as leaders of the nonprofit organizations that we all are associated with, we can't be questioned. If you have your core values, nobody can question your ethics or your morals or your intentions, because it all comes back to your values. And we have to make sure that we stay true to those. Like you said, if it's something that you're uncomfortable with, then you have the option to walk away and pursue other interests. But why were you there in the first place then? Is it your compassion? Is it your heart to be there, or are you just at a job? And I think that tends to color itself out again at the end of the day. If your heart is there and you have the compassion for what you're doing, it will show in your morals and your ethics.
Thank you, Ron. I see Kennedy and then Millie.
Hi,
Kennedy?
Dr. Taylor. How are you?
Hello.
I have a question. Each nonprofit or 501c3 leader has a fiduciary responsibility and duty to do the right thing. But what I've noticed on some of the organizations that I've been able to serve on a steering committee for, in those particular organizations that don't have a paid staff and are doing the work themselves and have their own full-time job, they don't have the background in nonprofit to, I guess, make the right decisions. And so even from a financial standpoint, not knowing how to fill out the right forms and what taxes they need to file. And so what would you suggest to those organizations that don't have seasoned nonprofit leaders to really understand what that work should look like and how they learn from an operational standpoint how to do business?
Yeah, thank you, Kennedy. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations, startup organizations that don't have paid employees, and we also, of course, understand that the majority of nonprofits out there are small. So anytime I guess organizations find themselves in that place, is just to remember that you can, whether it be a task force of volunteers targeting or identifying people that have the expertise that you need and engaging them into your organization as professionals. I mean, sometimes it's really hard to do, but Kennedy, if you're working with or have worked with or plan to work with an organization that's new or startup and the expertise just isn't around there, is just to remember, just as sure as nonprofit organizations mature one way or the other, they all kind of start that way. that you go out and find the people that do have the expertise and engage them in your process of learning. And, things like today, there's tons of things that you can learn online. I mean, I know that that's something that's just getting more popular every day of what you can learn about online. But it's a concern to the industry of exactly how that process goes. What do you do when you're just starting, or what do you do when you find yourself amongst young leaders that are passionate about something but don't know some of the traditionals or don't have some of the traditional skills? Not saying that you always do, because we find a lot of fascinating results from young leaders that are, that have a social conscious. But the only answer I guess I can provide is identify people that do have the expertise that you need and engage them as volunteers to your organization. And just as sure as they see your passion, they'll join you. You certainly might get some no's, but if you are real about it, and you really engage them in that process and pursue them, my experience has been that most will help you. Let's go to Millicent.
Well, greetings, Dr. Taylor. I had a quick question for you. You may have already discussed this, and I may have missed it. If I did, I do apologize. But I would love to know your perspective on the difference between personal and professional ethics. I really don't think that there is a difference between personal and professional ethics, but I really believe that that's some of the challenges that we see in society, that people do tend to have a home life and a work life that they kind of balance between. And I would kind of love to know your thoughts on how we can kind of better teach people to kind of develop a moral compass or a set of values that does not fluctuate when there's a change of scenery.
Oh man, you put me on the spot with that one. I don't know. So what I'll say is in the nonprofit space, and my answer is purely based on my personal experience. When I was the CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters in Austin, there was no separation between how I acted at my organization and in my daily life, because I knew that if I went out, think about it, in Austin, had fun at a happy hour, too much to drink, and happened to be pulled over or whatever it might be, it was hard to really separate how I chose to live my life around the type of work that I wanted to do and the type of person that I felt like I needed to be, to enjoy the work, to stick with the work, for it to last over time. So differences between, personal morals and personal ethics is personal and professional. Some may argue that, but you may have some limited opportunities. Again, I don't want to come across like I haven't had a bad day, went home and said, screw this, and, I have an MBA and I'm going to go work for a corporation or whatever it might be. Again, just to be real, I'm not saying that hadn't ever happened, but if you are committed to the work, mission-based work, my thoughts on that, again, regardless where anybody else sits, my thoughts on that is it's really hard to separate the two. And why would you do something for so long if there were some real differences there?
Perfect.
Let's go to
Thank
Val.
you.
I hope that was good enough for Millie.
It was perfect. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hi,
Hey,
Dr.
Val.
Hi, good to see you and good to see
Same here, always.
So thank you so much for the webinar. It's always so cool to come in and hear from you. I appreciate your acknowledgement of the challenges faced by nonprofit leaders. I personally believe it is a special kind of responsibility because we carry the weight of our organization's mission, and then with that, the trust of everyone who supports it. So it's a very significant responsibility. And I really resonated with the idea of holding ourselves and each other's accountable. It's always good to check yourself, check your power, especially for the people that have been at the top for a while. I know that's something that we're trying to implement over here at my organization, at the executive leadership level. But that said, many organizations, including mine, have these core values and these mission statements that kind of guide our ethical standards and how we operate. So that said, I'm interested in knowing if you have any, or if you can think of any effective ways to measure these ethics. So to put it into perspective, like for instance, you're bringing someone new on board to the organization, or in my case, in our organization, we just acquired another organization. So these are people that we didn't actually interview. We kind of just acquired them. How can we ensure that these people share our moral values, like the same ethics across the board? Is that even feasible, do you think?
I think it's feasible to a certain extent. I mean, you know, there's probably others on here that, you know, I know that have tons of experience that do this in different ways. But what my mind just went to based on your question is you can measure behavior, and there are tools to do that. One that's pretty simple is one that I've used in the past. And for some of our work around here at the center, the Authentic Leadership Questionnaire. And again, that's a tool that measures, you know, how self-aware someone is. It measures how transparent they are. It measures to what extent they engage others in decision-making processes. And it also measures, you know, overall ethics and morals. That's a tool that's a 16-question questionnaire that is easily implemented. Or you could design something custom for yourself. And there's two ways that you can do this. You can have those new people, say, that you acquired, rate themselves. And then after they've been on the job for a period of time, you can have others also rate them. And without getting too, you know, deep into the details, I mean, there's tons of other resource tools out there. Maybe choose one that you feel like fits for your organization. But when I found the ALQ, the Authentic Leadership Questionnaire, it seemed to be one when we're talking ethics and we're talking self-awareness, what we know about ourselves, transparency tends to come up. And we know that if you don't engage people that want to do good in decision-making processes, then something gets off in your team dynamics. That's just one that for me I think does a good job of, is easily implemented and gives you at least some information of how you might think about the question that you just posed.
Cool. Thank you so much. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Of course. Let's go to Paula. Paula, we see a hand up.
Yeah, good afternoon.
How
My
are you?
question honestly was the last person's question. I wanted to know, because when you said something that really struck a chord with me, that the nonprofit sector is the third largest. So you will see a lot of people just getting a job. And I had wanted to know, what are just a few questions you could ask during an interview that might could bring out their true reasons for wanting to work at this nonprofit, and if they even understand what a nonprofit is all about. We know they're not coming for money, because the average nonprofit salary is substantially lower than commercial salaries. So what are a few questions we can ask in an interview just to see where people's heads are at?
Paula, I think you actually said it, is the one that's interesting to me, is ask them what they know about the nonprofit sector and just simply see what kind of response they provide. And typically, and the reason why I mentioned that is because that's one of the first things we do in one of our first required classes here at the school is, you know, what do students know? What do people in general know about the nonprofit sector, or about a nonprofit, or about any nonprofit organization? What do you know about nonprofits? And see how they respond. And my guess is what we find anyways is people really don't know a whole lot about nonprofit organizations. But I guess if you find someone who gives you a functional answer that you can work with, or they reflect on maybe a secondary question is, why do you even have interest in work like this? And someone can reflect on that they were raised in a household that someone was impacted by a disease, or like myself, we used to go and pass out food over Thanksgiving. I think was some of my grounding when I started to first think about organizations that organize that type of work. Like, you know, how did they find themselves attracted to wanting to do the type of work, and what do they know about nonprofit organizations in general, and just see what kind of response you get. And any, you know, seasoned someone with the background in the space, I imagine you could filter pretty good through if the answer that they're giving you is bullshit, or or an answer that makes some sense.
Yeah, I guess that is true. Just really find out what they know about nonprofit, because a lot of people don't really understand. So I appreciate that response. And whenever I get up to your neck of the woods, I am gonna come see your quilts.
Nah, anytime. Okay,
All
I
right,
think
thank
that's
you.
good to see you. Thank you so much. I think that's about all we have time for. I want to thank you again for joining us today. Your continued support of our webinars. And you know, the one thing that I did not do is I did not share with you all. See if I can get it back up real quick. Let me see here. Our next webinar is on November 13th. So we'll continue in November. And that topic, we don't have a specific title just this moment, but it will be on systems change research. And then in February of 2025, we'll start with our next season for continuing and professional education opportunities with our certificate in nonprofit leadership. Let's see. And if you would do so, we always would like to ask you to connect with us on our socials and follow us at any of those that you use that we have up. But outside of that, again, I can't thank you enough for your time today. Thank you for your continued support of the work that we do here at the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Kenny.
Always, Ron, we appreciate you.